It's a very simple question. I mean, why the heck didn't natural selection do a better job? Why are we vulnerable to cancer? Why are we vulnerable to autoimmune disease? Why are we vulnerable to schizophrenia, anxiety? And there's no one answer. But that question, I think, has a lot of mileage left in it.
I'm Adam Hunt, and this is the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, rethinking mental health through an evolutionary lens. Share it with people who matter, like it if you like it, subscribe if you want to hear more. Dr. Randy Nesse, is a physician scientist who was instrumental in launching the field of evolutionary medicine. I'm sure many listeners to the podcast will know Randy's name, and he's appeared on episodes before. His career has really been dedicated to asking why our bodies and minds are vulnerable to disease. And he's probably made more progress in that and in building the field than anyone else. So after nearly 40 years on the psychiatry faculty at the University of Michigan, Randy moved to the Arizona State University to found and direct the Center for Evolutionary Medicine. He's co-authored the landmark bestseller, Why We Get Sick, with George Williams. We'll talk about that a little bit, I hope, today. And also, more recently, Good Reasons for Bad Feelings, which is, I think, almost uncontroversially the best introductory text to evolutionary psychiatry as a field, as well as authoring hundreds of articles and wonderful caliber and also wonderful accessibility. I think one of the things that stands out in Randy's writing is he really does convey complex ideas in a way that's appealing to a general audience and also a scientific and medical audience who may not be familiar with some of the broad literature which he references. He has played a pivotal role in the founding of core societies in the fields of evolution and behavior, but also most obviously in the International Society for Evolution, Medicine and Public Health, which is the world leading evolutionary medicine society. And he's been involved in much more besides that. Today, we're going to be talking about that actually, and him, rather than the sort of standard, oh, what is anxiety and how do we deal with anxiety and what's the evolutionary roots and what are the 6 reasons for disease, which I'm sure many of the listeners will be familiar with. I've been privileged to talk to Randy quite a bit over the last few years, and he's kind of told me many stories about how the field developed. And I thought it would just be great to share some of those stories and to go through your history and how it was coming from, the mid to late 20th century, before evolutionary medicine existed, before evolutionary psychiatry really existed, and yeah, how it's grown. So I think that everyone who's kind of interested in the field will be fascinated. Thank you so much, Randy, for coming on today.
I'm so grateful to you for doing all these podcasts, Adam. It's been wonderful to work with you to develop the field, and your glorious introduction of me is over the top, but welcome nonetheless.
Yeah, well, it's an honor and a privilege. So I'm looking forward to talking about the history, and then maybe we'll end on something about the future and think about where we're going. So yes, when I invited you to do this and I talked about some of the plan, you said we should start by talking about your sophomore invertebrate biology teacher who in 1968 encouraged your grand term paper topic on why aging exists, and where you went from there. So I mean, yeah, that's an interesting place to start. 1968.
So, I think that's the theme I'd like to strike in this interview, Adam, which is just how many wonderful folks, scientists mostly and teachers, have thought this is all worthwhile, even when nobody else did, and encouraged me to continue. I mean, can you imagine a sophomore who doesn't know any biology saying to his professor, I'd like to figure out why aging exists? Most professors would say, keep memorizing your genetics. But this guy said, sure, great idea. You're going to need to go take the bus to the Twin Cities. I was at Carleton College, and take your index cards and go looking for stuff. But great project. So I did. And I came up with this idea, which I may have told you before, that maybe aging was good for the species, because having some individuals die each year would allow the species to evolve faster. And wow, it was really fun working on that. I even came up with a method for measuring fish ages in different ponds by measuring their scales that you could use to test the idea. Um, then after that, it was Vietnam. And I didn't know I went to medical school because of Vietnam. I thought it was just a good thing to do to help people. But in retrospect, the honest part is I probably would not have if it hadn't been the war. And in medical school, I did what I was supposed to do and memorized all the stuff, but I kept asking these questions. Why does aging exist? And why do genes for cancer exist? And why are half of us nearsighted? And I wasn't too annoying, but I was moderately annoying to my professors asking these kinds of questions. And I just never got satisfaction from that. Soon enough, I started my psychiatry residency. I'd always wanted to be a psychiatrist. I was just curious about why so many people had so many problems. And I think we've talked about this before. I grew up in a neighborhood where it seemed like every other person had some serious problem. There was one who drank too much, another one who talked to her flowers, another one who committed suicide, another one who's just angry all the time. And I figured, oh my gosh, why so many? I thought it was like the well water in my neighborhood or something. Um, and and it was both relieving and really disturbing to realize once I got into psychiatry that it wasn't the well water, it wasn't my neighborhood, it was everyone everywhere. And so there I am as a junior psychiatrist, really feeling good about helping people one by one, but looking around me, and it's like there's this tsunami of mental problems. And it didn't seem to me we were going to solve it by finding a particular brain mechanism or by just doing behavior therapy. It seemed to me we needed some much broader perspective that would take everything into account. And I'll go on from there directly if you want me to, but I found my way finally to the Museum of Natural History, where Richard Alexander had a seminar about evolutionary behavior, and they allowed me to sit in, and immediately they welcomed me. This is another situation where really famous scientists welcomed a guy who didn't know anything and were polite. And they said, "Oh, you must study evolution all the time. All psychiatrists must study evolution, right?" I said, "Well, no, not exactly. In fact, I'm the only guy in my department who has any interest in this." I'll pause here for a second and see if you want to ask more questions to keep me organized here.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. I mean, I love the why. I think everyone who comes into the field, I talk to, young psychiatrists now, and that they all have some element of that why, although obviously you were a little bit more persistent, or maybe much more persistent about chasing it and developing it into something independently with no sort of guidance. I mean, the other thing that always hits me when I've talked to you a little bit about this history is it's probably so hard for people to living today or growing up with the internet to think about kind of the randomness and like the reliance on kind of being in a physical location or like stumbling upon a particular book. Um, so much used to be kind of constrained to these particular universities and these groups and these meeting groups and conferences and it seems like you were kind of partly in the right place at the right time, but you also it's nice to hear that you got you were seen by people who kind of recognized your interest and were interested in having you on, which I know that you do in turn. You pass it down generations, so I'm very thankful for that. um Okay, so you got into psychiatry because you were big in these why questions about the mind, but also about this kind of like larger.
Actually, it wasn't so grand. I just wanted to help people. It was the '60s, and I thought that's the way I can be most useful. It was that was the ethos of the time, and it felt good, and that was a great satisfaction of my career treating people. I really did love seeing people get better, and most people did. So that was really wonderful.
That's nice. But then what? So then what? Yeah, why evolutionary medicine? Hey, how long was this like sitting in the back of your mind for
Well, the aging,
decades?
why does aging exist was in the back of my mind, but I was really frustrated as a junior faculty member in the early 1980s because I mean, my friends were either becoming pharmacologists or brain scanners or psychoanalysts or behavior therapists, and I didn't want to limit myself to any one perspective. Um, Plus, it just seemed to me like there had to be some larger way, some framework for pulling all of these things together, which is, I still think, the wonderful contribution that evolution makes for psychiatry. It offers a framework that allows everything to come together to first understand and second treat these terrible disorders. And I've and we're still just getting going. Don't you agree? I mean, we're just barely getting going in getting this basic science that all animal behavior experts rely on into medicine and into psychiatry. So I was telling the story about going to the seminar that Dick Alexander ran with Bobby Lowe and a bunch of other, really great people, like welcoming me. And after a while, I got up my nerve and told them about my interest in evolution and aging and my sophomore paper. And they all kind of looked at each other, and some started laughing a little bit, and not to make too much of it, but they just quickly told me, "You don't know anything about biology, do you? Really?" They were smiling. And I said, "Oh, yes, I do. I have a very good education." But they pointed out that I had only learned the part of biology that was about how things work. I had never learned about how those mechanisms got to be the way they are. I had learned all kinds of stuff about behaviorism and brain mechanisms and all kinds of things, but I'd never learned about, so why are those mechanisms the way they are? And furthermore, they immediately told me that my whole notion about aging possibly being good for the species was entirely contradicted by the whole notion of group selection just doesn't work, they said. I said, "Really, really?" And they said, "Go read Williams' 1957 paper." And I got it on my way home, putting quarters into a Xerox machine. That's how we did it back then. And it just completely blew me away. There was an evolutionary explanation for aging. And for those listeners who don't know it already, some genes that cause aging are there just because they've never been selected against. But many others are there because they give advantages earlier in life. And therefore they're selected for, even though they eventually kill every member of a species. And that completely blew my mind. And I realized, oh my gosh, if we can explain aging, what about schizophrenia? What about eating disorders? What about depression? What about all these other things I'm trying to deal with? I didn't know George Williams at that time, um, but very quickly I published my first paper on evolution and psychiatry in 1984. At the same time, I dug into the literature about evolution and aging and wrote a couple of articles confirming George Williams's theory about evolution and aging by going to life history tables. My chairman was marvelous. John Graydon was a new chairman of psychiatry, and he allowed me to spend a whole summer digging into the library and looking up life history tables of animals in the wild and publishing those papers. Um, I don't know why it wasn't part of any plan. I just was curious about it. But lo and behold, that's of course what led to George Williams taking me seriously. And when I finally met him, I didn't realize he was like one of the most famous and accomplished evolutionary biologists in the world. But he was completely receptive. He said, "I'm looking for a doctor to work with on evolution and medicine." I said, "Well, I've been trying to find an evolutionary biologist to work on this new question, not just why things are the way they are, but why do they break? Why didn't natural selection do a better job?" And I'll just say one more thing about that for everybody out there who's trying to figure out how schizophrenia is useful and all that kind of nonsense. Um, that is, George and I spent a couple of months asking each other, how is breast cancer useful? How is atherosclerosis useful? Completely off base in retrospect, because those things aren't useful. But if we can make that mistake, talking together for months, then we've got to be sympathetic towards everybody else in the field who starts off by making that fundamental mistake.
Yeah, no, the obvious kind of initial reaction to the idea of evolutionary psychiatry or evolutionary medicine is, oh yeah, what's the benefit? But it's always much more complicated than that, right? There's byproducts of things, and adaptations can't be perfected. And you've gone and you spent a lot of your career. Perhaps one of the major contributions of your career is kind of listing the main kind of core processes which by which things are likely to break or could lead to harms in modern societies when they wouldn't have previously, or and the various reasons for sickness. Uh,
And I think the core insight that George and I had after those long conversations is that trying to explain diseases directly is a mistake. Trying to explain traits that make every member of a species vulnerable to a disease is the insight that led to evolution in medicine. And part two was not just saying it in general, but saying, hey, there are six possibilities. It might be natural selection just couldn't do it. It might be that it was beneficial back then, but not now, mismatch. It might be that it increases your reproductive success, even at the cost of health. It might be it's a trade-off of some kind. It might be it's just something natural selection can't do because there are laws of chemistry and physics. So there's just a few categories, and those have helped a lot of people, I think, to structure their analyses. And I've continued to think about that every week since in the last 40 years. And I've got a new paper in the works, and there's one of mine that just came out this week that goes into that in more detail. We can talk about that at the end since it's fresh. But this is not an easy thing that I feel has been mastered and settled. I think we all need to keep talking about how do we summarize the categories that explain failures, not only in bodies, but in machines. We'll come back to that.
Hmm. Right. So, okay. So, but yeah, let's go back to the history. So you met George. You did you initially just decide to write a book, or what was it, like a paper for?
Oh, no, we agreed to write a paper, and
Yeah.
we spent about a year doing that. That was grandly titled "The Dawn of Darwinian Medicine."
Yeah.
I said, George, why don't we just call it some evolutionary ideas that might be useful in medicine? And he said, no, we're trying to. So, okay, you're the big guy and you get to choose. And of course, he was right. It did turn out to be the dawn of Darwinian medicine. It didn't have the impact of the book that we wrote 4 years later, exactly 4 years after my first article about evolution and psychiatry. And why we get sick, as you mentioned. But people didn't pay that much attention to why we get sick at first. It was reviewed well, but like so many books, it kind of faded. But then Steve Stearns ran a couple of large professional meetings in Switzerland and came out with 2 edited volumes with the world's leaders in biology, talking about various aspects of evolution that could be applied to medicine. I wrote chapters for both of those books, mostly on standards of evidence. How the heck do you tell which things are true and which things are false? My continued preoccupation. But it was Steve's work that really got that going. Probably 1996 or so is when those conferences were. So he was the person who really got everybody together from the field of biology to make this all happen.
Mm, interesting. And I know, okay, and then the societies at the time. I mean, you had the sociobiology wars kind of going on. That was like the evolutionary psychology was sort of a hot topic in many ways, both in the academic space and also the sort of social space. Is that why you kind of lent a little bit more towards the evolutionary medicine side rather than the psychiatry side? Because you were a psychiatrist by training, right? So it is strange to me that 2019 was good reasons for bad feelings, but like 30 years before,
Why not do it sooner, hey?
yeah.
Um, so, University of Michigan back in the 1980s was the world center for sophisticated evolutionary thinking about the levels of selection and behavior. It was really Dick Alexander who was the leader of that, but the brilliant. I mean, Richard Wrangham was there, and Barbara Sputz was there, and Bobby Lowe was there, and Warren Holmes was there, and John Matani was there, and Alan Gibbard is a well-known moral philosopher who I had lunch with weekly for a couple of years. He was one of the more sophisticated people about evolution and medicine and evolution and behavior. It was just an incredibly rich environment. And even now, most of the leaders of evolutionary medicine were at Michigan at that time. Uh, it was just fabulous. Um, it wasn't, in Dick Alexander in particular, he wasn't all nicey and encouraging. His basic approach to almost anything he gave to him was that shit. You want to know why? I mean, um, and
Yeah.
I think he didn't put up with any nonsense. He said ridiculous, outrageous things that would get you kicked off the faculty these days. But it worked. If people who read this or who listen to the podcast might look to the Festschrift about Dick Alexander, has brilliant articles by many of his former students. Steve Frank was one of them. It's just a marvelous group. Anyway, I was a part of a group that got funding from the provost, Billy Fry, to start something called the Evolution Human Behavior Program in 1986. And then that program brought in some postdocs, and we ran meetings that brought people from all over the country and all over the world to talk about evolution and human behavior. And in 1988, that was all kind of fading a bit, and the funding, nobody wanted to organize another meeting. So Bobby Lowe and I organized one more last meeting. And at that meeting, we founded the Human Behavior and Evolution Society. And so I spent much of the next 10 years helping to develop that society. We had got Bill Hamilton to be the first president. I was the second, and what an adventure that was. Michael McGuire was the editor of the journal. What was it called? Sociobiology and something or other, um, and ethology and sociobiology.
Yeah.
And he very gracefully allowed us to switch that journal to the new title of Evolution and Human Behavior, which
Mm.
Ed Wilson didn't like at all. Ed held quite a grudge against me for a couple of years because he thought sociobiology should still be in the title, but it was clear to me that that was an Ed Wilson focus thing, and the field had to be much more broad and general to let everybody participate. But all of those conversations were marvelous. When I went to talk about evolution in medicine, though, it was really clear that as soon as I revealed I was a psychiatrist, people didn't take me seriously anymore. So I was giving talks about cancer, I was giving talks about infectious disease, I was giving talks about mismatch. And I really, in general, stayed away from my identity as a psychiatrist just because people don't generally take psychiatrists seriously unless they're going to do a brain scan or genetic studies. So it was wise, I think, to just focus on evolution in medicine for a number of years, although I did write an article about evolution in panic disorder and one about evolution in substance abuse, and I had a good time doing that. And then we finally come to 1990, which I think is what a wonderful year for me. That's when I finally published my big article on evolution and emotions. And I spent a whole year full time trying to figure out, okay, I'm treating people with emotional disorders full time. Do I know what emotions are and why they're that way and how they're controlled? I didn't. And at the end of that year, I was very frustrated furthermore because um, there just didn't make any sense. I mean, everybody's arguing about how many emotions are there and what's each one for. And that didn't make sense. So I think that 1990 article, which really continues to be a landmark, took a different approach. It said, instead of trying to figure out how many emotions there are and what each one is for, we should ask, what situation shaped this capacity for this emotion? And that immediately made it clear that there aren't separate, distinct emotions, that they're overlapping with each other, meaning that you don't have to keep arguing about that for another 100 years. So that's been the key to my work on evolution and emotions. And that's only one small part, as you know, of evolutionary psychiatry, although it's a big one because emotions are defenses. They're useful. And that led immediately to the smoke detector principle, which I think many people would say is my greatest concrete contribution. Recognizing that signal detection theory from engineering helps you to understand why false alarms are essential for an optimal system turned out to be practical in my actual work with panic disorder. I was seeing hundreds of patients with panic disorder, and all of a sudden, I finally realized why the system was vulnerable. It's because natural selection shaped an optimal control system that had to have panic, had to have false alarms in order to be sure that there was a proper panic attack to prevent life-threatening danger. I'll pause there again for a minute.
Right. Right. So yeah, being overly sensitive to various emotions, perhaps jealousy as well, is maybe something which we should be overly sensitive towards. And yeah, there are all sorts of emotional reactions, defenses where it's just better to be cautious just in case.
Mm.
And that can lead to a lot of psychological stress, even actual harm. But so long as on average across the population, the response is sort of is shaped to be beneficial. Yeah, for reproductive success. That is interesting. So, and I do think it's cool to also rewind because when you told me this story previously, um, like people probably don't appreciate that HBEARS is like the largest evolutionary psychology society and conference in the world. So it's cool that you were part of that founding as well, and you were really there
Mm.
in that situation. It's also just so interesting that everything was happening in Michigan. Did you join Michigan for that very reason, or like what?
No,
Is it just
I went to Michigan. I went to medical school at Michigan and stayed on to do my residency and stayed on as a faculty member. I went there instead of other medical schools because they had a great library, compared with some newer medical schools that didn't have a proper library. That's when you had to go into the library and browse in the stacks and write stuff down on index cards. It's such an exciting world now where you can get whatever you want from Google Scholar in an instant. It's just fabulous. Mhm.
Yeah. it's so much more efficient. And I'm also just thinking for building a field and like finding other people who are kind of interested in what you do and being able to collaborate and learn from them. And if it's completely reliant on being in a lecture hall with someone who's an expert, like it's so random, but we have the internet and I could meet you almost entirely online. I think we met for about 2 or 3 years before we actually met in real life at
Right,
an
right.
advice center meeting. And it's just amazing. And it's the same for the evolutionary psychiatry group in the UK.
And let's go sideways on that for a minute. I think new technology has made a lot of this possible. One wonderful year I was invited to the Institute for Advanced Study in Berlin for a year in 2007, 2008. And they had been inviting people for some time to develop the field of evolutionary medicine. And I brought a group of 7 people with me to work on how to develop the field. But in the process of that, we found we wanted to connect everybody in the world. So we started, first of all, a little Excel spreadsheet where people could put their information on. And then we created the Evolution Medicine Review. That was my big project there. And with Catriona McCallum, she was the editor of PLOS Biology. And together we did a whole bunch of coding to make our WordPress site up and going. And that is where everything really got going for organizing people and people meeting each other and posting papers there and the like. If it hadn't been for that, I don't think we'd have the society or anything else. So these modern tools have made the growth of this field possible when it wouldn't have been possible otherwise.
Right. And yes, you have been absolutely the sort of leading figure in the International Society for Evolution Medicine and Public Health, which again has like very little psychiatry in it. I attend the meetings, I help with some of the organization-y, communication-y stuff. But yeah, there's like so little psychiatry. I want more psychiatry. It's fine. We have the psychiatry groups elsewhere, but it's just
Well, we had a pretty wonderful evolutionary psychiatry meeting last year, a special
we did.
special meeting.
That was a special, that was excellent. I really enjoyed that. But yes, it's interesting to me that you have these kind of wide ranging interests and ability to kind of cross the fields and like I mean, this is what we need, right? You need these broad conceptual kind of syntheses of which are giving you a kind of an overarching framework through which to understand kind of all disorder, and then hopefully people will look at their own specific, whatever cardio or cancer, and then try and apply those principles. But we needed that.
But we should pause in case there are young people watching. I mean, that's no plan for developing a career. I mean, nobody's going to pay you for wide-reaching, grand ideas about how to connect different fields. You got to just do it and put up with various chairmen and others saying, "Why aren't you getting grants to do tests of drugs and stuff like that?" You just have to put up with a lot of that stuff. And uh, I've I've never been I've never done what I'm supposed to do, and people have been pretty generous generally, except for when they weren't. There are moments like my promotion committee at University of Michigan saying, "We'd like you to know that you'll never be promoted again unless you give up this evolution stuff."
Wow.
I said, "Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate knowing." No, how the knowing, and the people who said that,
Oh,
people who said that are all retired and bored, and and they didn't get stuff like that. But that's just, I think that's just what always happens if you're trying to do something new. And you just have to kind of recognize it. On the other hand, there are other people, committees and groups and policies. University of Michigan wants to be interdisciplinary, like and innovative. Everybody wants to, but they can't really do it because what they really have to balance their budgets, and the deans always get rated on how much money they bring in and that kind of thing. But occasionally there's someone who's farsighted. Nancy Cantor was a provost at University of Michigan, and I knew her slightly, but she recognized that evolutionary medicine was an important thing. And she arranged for me to move half time of my appointment to the Institute for Social Research and then to psychology. And I could not have done my work in evolution medicine if it wasn't for her intervention. I was just seeing patients all day and trying to get grants into medical school. It just would not have been possible. So a few people like that have just been marvelous in helping things to happen that just would not have happened otherwise. Also, have the evolution of human behavior program that was the nidus, the focus, the origin of new studies in evolution and human behavior. After 8 years, it hadn't gotten grants, and the university decided, well, we're going to shut it down. And we said, well, hey, we're changing the world. They said, well, that's nice, but we're shutting this down. But a couple of years after that, I asked Nancy if we could start something called the Evolution and Human Adaptation Program, EHAP. And for the next 12 or 14 years, I somehow or another used the small funds that she provided to invite somebody in every week or so to give a talk about evolution and human behavior. And that was another marvelous way of getting to know people and inviting in world leaders and the like. I think that also did a lot to develop the field, all because Nancy Cantor allocated, just a few $1,000s every year to make something possible. It's just so, I appreciate so much these people who have a vision and they don't pay any attention to anything else, they just do it.
Wow, that's yeah, it's so funny to think of like the counterfactual. Like, what if that run like that one charitable person just hadn't done it? Then you kill a whole field, right? Or you just you stop it. I would argue that the evolutionary psychiatry and medicine are inevitable. That the fit the theory of
Slower.
famously could have taken decades, hopefully not centuries longer, but yeah, it's those chances. We've actually just set up the first foundation dedicated to funding evolution and psychiatry in the UK,
Great.
and which you generously donated to as well. Thank you for that. The website is almost ready. Actually, I can send it to you
Oh,
off.
good.
Do we finish this recording? But anyway, one of the lines we have there is that the of $4 billion going to mental health research worldwide every year, approximately zero is going to evolution informed research, which is just bizarre to me. It's spending so much money and never really seeing patient outcomes improve, and not really kind of scrabbling around looking for explanations in these proximate mechanisms, which are just really messy. And no one is thinking about the kind of grand theory, the grand unifying theory of biology. And I do think we don't need 4 billion. We need a million. I don't know, maybe a few million.
So, but I think it's up to us though to show how we want to use the money and what it'll do, and we haven't quite managed that yet. Yes, it would be wise to really get things going. I listened to a bunch of books on tape while driving on a long drive recently, and I was impressed by the ones about how great science is and how it's developed COVID vaccines and all kinds of. And I thought to myself, wait a second, we could justify spending a few $1 million in evolution and psychiatry, but we have not yet gotten our act together to say exactly what we need to do and why. And I think that's not just because we're slow learners. I think it's because of the nature of the kind of questions that we're asking. Behavioral ecologists have gotten pretty good at structuring their questions and asking about life history traits and looking at comparative studies to test their hypotheses and experimental methods. Most of those methods are not readily available to us in studying human behavior, and certainly not human abnormal behavior and the like. So I think we should just pause and say we're in a really tough field. I mean, this is tougher than rocket science in some ways because it's not just using established mathematical and manipulation methods. There are real conceptual barriers still to trying to do what we're trying to do. And I think that the very structure of organic systems, this is my new theme, Adam. I think that trying to understand why things have developed slowly requires us to take a long, hard look at how natural selection shapes these systems. And it's so fundamentally different from how designers design mechanical systems and computer systems. And those systems have specific parts with specific functions and limited numbers of connections. So you can draw a diagram with boxes and arrows and make them all make sense. And this is really the model that biological psychiatry has been following, as if it's a structured system that's designed by an engineer with each part of the brain and each neurotransmitter having a particular specific function. But I'm pretty sure that's going to turn out to be all wrong. They have multiple functions or overlapping structures or overlapping things. It's really messy in there in a way that's very unsatisfying. I mean, we want to do science because it simplifies. But what about when reality, organic complexity, is not simple at all? And in fact, its kind of complexity is different. Sorry to go off on this tangent, but this is where I am right now, is trying to figure out if things really are complex in a fundamentally different way than design systems. Then how do we proceed? I mentioned the article that has just come out in PNAS Nexus this week. And that's all about comparing the explanations for failure of design systems like machines and computer systems as compared with evolved systems, which are first of all bodies, but I think also social groups can be viewed as evolving systems. So it's been a wonderful project. Guru Madhavan is Director of Programs for the National Academy of Engineering, and Jay Labov, you know well, he's been the chair of the Education Committee for the International Society for Evolutionary Medicine and Public Health. We've had a wonderful 2 years working together to develop this article. It never would have happened without the three of us all talking together for ages and hours. But I think we've accomplished something. I think it should be a wooden stake through the heart of the metaphor of body as machine. That's what this article should be. But we're not confident that anything will actually do away with that metaphor because it's been so useful. And because when you say, I don't like the metaphor, people assume you're talking some spiritual gobbledygook or something anti-scientific. No, we're just talking about the structural complexity being different in evolved systems. So that's my hobby horse. That'll probably occupy me quite thoroughly for the next few years.
I've heard you present on this and talk about this before, and I'm interested. I haven't actually read the paper yet, but I will, of course. And yes, it rings true to me because in the last couple of months, I've been concentrating much more on ADHD research because my project here in Cambridge is to study the effects of evolutionary explanations on the stigmatization of various severities of ADHD. So I need to know more about ADHD, and I've been listening to lots of lectures, and a lot of them have this like little neurobiology segment, which is like the most oversimplified. It's like, oh, the frontal lobe is not talking to whatever the striatum, and like, oh, and
It is dopamine. It is dopamine somehow,
it's
but
always dopamine, but like my, my laugh is dopamine. I mean, yeah, it's just it's funny because they do most of the lecture, which I think people find, because you also read through the comments and you see whether people are kind of liking these explanations and what they find relevant. And often, people just talk about the symptoms and what it means to have ADHD and how you feel, and is it time blindness or, yeah, is it really?
and the kinds of suffering that come from not being able to do what classroom teachers want you to do. I mean,
Yes.
it's terrible for people to be just left behind because their minds work differently.
Right. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And you're putting people, it's a very clear example of mismatch. You're putting people in this very weird environment where they have to sit there for 9 hours, just like trying to stare at a board. And then people feel stupid. And then that causes other problems. And maybe they get depressed because of that. And, it's all really complicated. But yes, but then the fact is, that we don't really properly understand the neurobiological mechanisms behind ADHD, and you can't really use brain scans to differentiate one ADHD person from a non-ADHD person, and it's really blurry. And we find, some correlations in some studies, but different correlations in other studies. And it's been in the same way that kind of the neuroscience of psychopathology has kind of gone through a replication crisis. ADHD is certainly one of those cases. But the simple explanation is still there and still sort of serves like people just want to hear like something which sounds like, oh, we understand what's gone wrong in the brain, and it's this disconnection, and you're like, oh yeah, maybe I am disconnected from, like, it as the metaphor, I'm disconnected from, my chores, and it's a brain disconnection. It just makes perfect sense, and it's such a lovely, crisp, clean explanation which fits our psychology so well, despite the scientific validity being, it's
So this is another thing that I swear, and we're on similar tracks because I've been thinking so much recently about the fact that we are all simple thinkers. It's not just those other people who are saying there was no COVID, they're blaming COVID vaccine for stuff and being stupid. But I think we humans all want things to be simple. We want there to be well-defined conditions. We want ADHD to be all by itself, the nice line around it, and say what it is and what it isn't. And we want it to have a specific cause. And we're very frustrated when reality isn't like that. We rebel, and we try to do it. And worse yet, our human minds, we all figure out the first explanation that we come up with, because we all like the explanations we come up with, and then we stick to it, and we find all the evidence that fits it, and we argue with other people. We form groups to advocate for ours and not the others. Um, and I think that would be the title of a book that I will probably never have time to write, but it was just called "We Are All Simplistic Thinkers." Um,
get an AI to write it and then just check it and pop shit under your name. Write a book under the with the style of Randolph Nesse and call it this. Um, yes, I realize we're getting off track here, and I need to be talking about your career and how evolutionary psychiatry and medicine. But yeah. So one of the interesting things that I think is kind of relevant, especially to kind of listeners today in the podcast era, is just yeah, realizing like how have you perceived the fields change and also the perception of well the audience reaction, let's put it that way. Like, do you think that the I mean, you've kind of mentioned that you were savvy to the idea that you couldn't really be a psychiatrist because actually, you know, back in especially the 60s and 70s, psychiatry was seen as kind of a woo-woo and arguably was partly kind of, you know, unscientific. And so there was that kind of carried over a bit into the late and mid 20th century, but now is probably not not the case, not the case. But you still had to fight biological psychiatry, huge amounts of effort in
So
neuroscience.
don't say fight, don't say fight biological psychiatry, because I think those people are trying to do really useful things, and they're very smart, and they might come up with a specific explanation for one or another syndromes. And furthermore, I mean, the problem is they're only using half of biology. A real biological psychiatry would spend 50% of its time trying to understand how those mechanisms got that way, instead of just how they work. So I don't see them as the enemy or opposition, although some of them are pretty blind to the need to answer both kind of questions.
Yes. Yeah, I meant fight psycholo I mean, we are completely integrative and also psychosocial research, right? Like the fact
Mhm.
that social factors have a massive impact on psychology is clearly, you know, you need an evolutionary background to kind of understand that. And myself and Rhea Bed and Paul St. John Smith have published quite a bit on this. The relationship between how the evolutionary sciences can kind of undergird the biological, the psychological, and the social, the evo-biopsychosocial, as we call it. The Yeah, so yeah, conceptually, that's absolutely what evolution is doing. But then kind of socially, people are just doing the brain scans and they're quite sure they're going to find the breakage in the brain. And so, you know, it's just it wasn't easy for evolutionary psychiatry to get its foot in. But then I was recently in a meeting in London at the Royal College of Psychiatrists with trainees who seemed very open-minded and kind of said that they sensed a shift in the trainees in general, which is that people were kind of feeling that the promises of biological psychiatry have not basically come to fruition, which is not to say that biological psychiatry may never come to fruition, but it's definitely the promises have not yet um, come to fruition, and it's messy and unclear because you have these diagnostic blurriness in the first place. That's which makes it like, what is ADHD? Can you really find one breakage to explain ADHD? That's probably not going to happen. But yeah, they seem quite open-minded, and it was exciting actually to talk to the younger generation and see that they were really open-minded to the evolutionary approach. But yeah, I was just wondering from your perspective, how have you seen things shift? What
So that I've never encountered real criticism of my views about evolution and psychiatry. Of course, I've been quite careful not to go too far and not to make claims that can't be supported somehow. But I've had opportunities to talk before, plenary talks before the American Psychiatric Association and the world's meetings, and especially the neuroscience and neuropsychopharmacology people. My original research was neuropharmacology and neuroendocrine responses to anxiety, so I have some credentials in that area. And they've listened. They said that's really interesting. So there's no real criticism, but it's not clear what they're supposed to do next. And I think this is what's missing. We need to figure out, what do we want people to do? What kind of studies, what kind of data? Um, the largest funder of mental health research, other than NIH, a few years ago, decided to have a huge push to solve depression. I won't name them because I'm going to go back to them fairly soon, I think. And I think they allocated $50 million to try to get at the roots of depression. And they had a fellow who does DARPA style central planning. So instead of a committee, they had somebody really try to figure out, by talking to all the world's leaders, what could we do? And they finally decided that they were going to study the people who had the absolute worst forms of depression, where they couldn't eat, couldn't talk, and couldn't do anything. And they were going to find the brain mechanisms for that. I think that was 6 or 7 years ago, and I looked to see what had come from all of that, tens of millions of dollars. As far as I can tell, the answer is nothing. And I was pretty vocal at the time of that. I said, listen, before we can make progress on depression, we have to understand in what situations is it useful, multiple situations, how is it normally regulated, what are the brain mechanisms involved, but what are the psychological mechanisms and the social factors that regulate ordinary. If we can't understand, that, we're never going to make progress. I was not convincing. Um, but I'm going to try again. And I think I'd like to go back and say, with a fraction of what you've already spent that didn't really come to anything, I think we could actually provide the proper scientific foundation for understanding how natural selection shapes capacities for mood. And there are multiple functions in multiple overlapping situations, which is also going to get me in a little bit of trouble with my evolution and psychiatry friends, because so many of them are advocating for one function for mood and arguing about it's for this or for that. And I don't think that's going to work. I think we have to acknowledge that things shaped by natural selection have these blurry boundaries and multiple functions.
Yeah, no, yeah. Anger won't have a single function, or pride or shame. I agree. It's just messy.
Yeah.
Right? How do you even define it? And like, there's little bits of it in all sorts of situations which are not fully manifesting. But like, yeah, it's a whole mess.
But that's something else where things have gotten really good. When I started out, 1990, evolution was seen as a suspicious thing. Emotions researchers shouldn't mess with it too much. And now most emotions researchers base their work on evolution to some way or another. And I think that, and they're getting away steadily from the simplistic versions of, six main emotions, with each with a specific function. So I think progress is actually happening there. And, psychiatrists going to look for emotions where they could turn to emotions researchers, and they got lost immediately in all of the philosophical arguments. But I think progress in that field is ready to be moved into evolutionary psychiatry, into the clinic. We're getting there.
Right. I wonder if this is the path forward for the field, because you don't really need a whole separate thing, which is evolutionary psychiatry. You just need current psychiatrists to know that evolution is explaining the neuroscience and the social
Mm.
effects and the psychological effects. And we've kind of seen in psychology that a lot of psychologists who are not evolutionary psychologists do just reference evolution, and kind of quite casually they understand, oh yeah, the things we're studying, the developmental processes, or the trajectories or the emotions, there's an evolutionary explanation behind that. And okay, it might, direct their thinking a little bit in the background, but it's not like they consider themselves as evolutionary psychologists. So yeah, I do think that that seems like the most likely option for what evolutionary psychiatry could be in whatever 20 years.
That's a nice point, Adam. At Michigan, David Buss was another big leader at the University of Michigan, of course.
Right.
And there was a push to maybe create an evolutionary psychology program within the Department of Psychology. And I opposed that. I said all of psychology should be based on evolutionary theory. There shouldn't be a special kind of psychology that's evolutionary. I think David has shown me wrong about that. There did need to be a kind of evolutionary psychology that was special with its own methods and its own conclusions. Um, but I think that an evolutionary foundation for psychiatry. But again, I've had my say, and I have major chapters in all the major textbooks now, and people like them and say, "Boy, that's inspirational. That's good." And then they go around and doing what they did before. So one couldn't see it as progress, but those of us trying to advance this field need to keep looking inwards about um, what can we do to help ourselves as well as others understand just how difficult this is and why it's difficult. It's not that people are opposed to us or that they're not smart. It's that what we're trying to do is really fundamentally new in a way that's hard for any of us to really understand.
Right. And where's it? I mean, in a very practical sense, like where's it integrated into the curriculum? Which part of the curriculum do you kick out? And
Oh,
I'm
and now you're going to tap into my real frustration. I ran the residency program at the University of Michigan for 6.5 years. It was really exciting. In fact, I had a seminar for my residents. We met at 6 o'clock in the morning. Can you imagine that? And we just and talked about evolution and psychiatry, and they loved it. I mean, they're used to it because you're an intern. That's when you come to work. And there's no time later in the day. I mean, a lot of them absorbed it really deeply and went on to keep thinking evolutionary terms. But once I left, that all kind of went away. That there's nobody there who knows about evolution and medicine or evolution and psychiatry to continue to teach it. And you can't get grants to do it, and you're not going to get promoted for doing it. So it's kind of a non-starter for a junior faculty member to take up that the reins for that. Um,
Yeah, this is just it's like an incentive structure problem of academia in general, right? Like you just, yeah, everything's getting approved by grant committees who are formed of people who are of another paradigm. So they're not going to just approve you instead of the person who's doing neuroscience or genetics or whatever. Um,
but on the other
yeah,
hand, I have gotten these invitations to all the biggest meetings, and the textbooks are including chapters on evolution and psychiatry. It's really up to us to say what we can do differently. Yeah, and we should come to the London gang. It's not just London now; it's all across the British Isles. But Riad Abed and Paul St. Smith, along with your help and that from a few other people there, have done more than anybody else to develop the field. I'm embarrassed that I haven't been able to do anything nearly as instructive and connected as what you all have done there. The fact that so many individuals are keen, it's fabulous. And the newsletter that newsletter is great, and the meetings that are happening are great. So it's really coming along.
it is exciting. I think there's a different incentive structure problem there, comparing the US to the UK and also Europe, probably to be kind of clustered with the UK, just because being a psychiatrist in the NHS, you don't have the same sort of profit incentives for handing out drugs or insurance companies to go to, and you're kind of it's much more sort of interdisciplinary, and there's much more of a sort of psychosocial bent and even some kind of psychodynamic. I mean, mainly in France, but there's a bit of that in the UK. So I think that perhaps that has led the psychiatrists in the UK to just be a bit more open-minded to new perspectives and not not quite as honed in as like what is the new drug that we have having to push or whatever. They want to take the oldest drug that's the cheapest, that's out of patent.
Mm.
That's the incentive structure over here.
So, but I find a lot of psychiatrists in the States, they're really frustrated by the system that pushes them to prescribe drugs and see people briefly. And a lot of them are thoughtful, well-educated people who would love to take a broader approach to treating their patients. But as you say, that the structure makes it very hard for those people to have satisfying careers.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, well, we'll see. So
On the other hand, if you or I were organizing, how do you allocate resources to maximize the benefit of psychiatrists to the populace? You're not going to have psychiatrists spending hours with individual patients, getting to know them over months and years and talking about their lives because there aren't enough psychiatrists even to make good decisions about drug prescribing. I'm very frustrated by that because, I hated being put in a situation where I just evaluated people and sent them off to other people. I wanted to get to know my patients and try to help them talk about their lives over the long period. I was in a privileged position where I could do that because my income didn't depend on it, and my chairmen were relatively sympathetic to providing care that I thought was best. But I think many, many psychiatrists are in positions where they're frustrated and they can't do that. And this is beyond the power of anybody because these are economic factors and the reality of there never will be enough psychiatrists to do much more than make diagnoses of the most severe people, severely ill people, and do proper medical and psychopharmacological interventions.
yeah, this is something I've been working on a little bit in the last month or two with a primary care researcher. We're looking at applying for grants in the UK, but with a kind of concentration on the sort of public health and primary care angle, because the psychiatrists in the UK are just, it's the most severe cases. Your evolutionary perspectives probably are not going to be that, that useful in the sort of casual way of making someone who's a little bit anxious feel okay about their anxiety, or telling someone about the smoke detector principle. And then they're kind of like, oh, okay, I won't worry so much, and I won't go and get a panic attack over it because, and I won't think I'm dying. Those are sorts of the most obvious connotations that I can see kind of having practical impact on the day-to-day basis, which you've talked about in some cases with your patients.
I think those ideas are getting across, actually.
Yeah.
Do you?
Yeah.
I mean, I think in general, people are recognizing now, hey, anxiety is useful. I think the smoke detector principle is people are catching on to that. And I think the idea that low mood can be useful, or at least that it's not always abnormal, is also gaining traction. So I think there are a lot of areas in which evolutionary psychiatry and evolutionary medicine is changing things in a good way without necessarily getting credit for it. I mean, for instance, the British, there was recently an article saying the antibiotic heyday is over. We don't need to treat every patient with an extra week of antibiotics after their fever is gone. We can stop. And they never made any reference to the evolutionary medicine research. They just used a few, controlled trials. But I think deeper evolutionary thinking about why the body is the way it is in evolutionary medicine is permeating things and helping, even though the field is not necessarily getting credit.
Yes, and I'm sure that it will do. I'm hoping to actually test some of these ideas, show that it does, it does help people to be informed of something like the smoke detector principle, and yeah, maybe the psychiatrists won't be helped as much as the public health researchers and the GPs. So
But we
yes,
got to pause here because it's tricky. I mean, back to the simplistic thinking business. You know, there's for a while there, I stopped giving radio interviews because every time I talk to somebody on the radio, they say, "Oh, Doctor Nesse, so you think depression is useful, so we shouldn't treat it?"
mm,
I said, "No, we treat pain, we treat broken legs, we treat all kinds of things. Yeah, but
right, that's
you think it's useful, so basically there's nothing wrong." And that level of thinking could very easily get into general practitioners and the like, and not be so good. So
yeah.
but I think you're well aware of this. It's
I
very
am.
tricky.
One of the chapters of my PhD, the fourth chapter of my PhD, is exactly commenting on this. And I mean, we treat fertility, which is the ultimate adaptation
We treat
treat
when?
fertility. We prevent fertility with contraceptive pills. Like there is no more clear adaptation than being fertile. And the fact that we think it's actually totally acceptable for doctors to give out pills to make you infertile briefly is actually just obvious proof that a medicine is not meant to be kind of obeying whatever
Mhm.
adaptive fitness enhancing mechanisms which may have shaped the bodies and brains that we have. Uh,
Right.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's an important thing to note. It's one of the things that we should always say, along with the sort of anti-gesto storytelling, and it's not all an adaptation. The other thing is, and whatever the explanation is, it doesn't have some imperative for how we should treat people.
Right.
It's just an explanation that might be useful, and in some cases might help you work out, oh, this thing in my life is the problem that's causing my depression. Um, and
So what you just put your finger on there, I think, is where we could have a huge impact. I mean, I think we do have the capacity of helping people look into the motivational structure of their own lives and try to figure out the sources of some problems that they might not be aware of. It's not the subtle psychodynamics and unconscious stuff, although some things are psychodynamic and unconscious. But there are a lot of times people are really trapped in bad social situations that are causing both anxiety and depression and anger. And if they were easy to solve, people would solve them. So it's not a matter of just saying, "Oh, do this." But I think this is very useful for trying to understand. Do I dare say people as animals or animals? I mean, we're all built to have certain motives and difficulties we face, and competitions and obstacles and failures and losses and gains, and all organisms are like that. And I think that does not make you treating people like animals. It means respecting people's emotions as something that's not just abnormal. And I think that central idea of respecting emotions in general to figure out whether they're useful or not for that person, to figure out whether they're normal or abnormal for that person. And that's the missing foundation that I think everybody would find really helpful.
right, and it could have impacts across many spheres of human life. I'm thinking now of a recent conversation I had with a kind of friend of a friend who works in the city of London and is just in business and is doing like consulting or some kind of very businessy business. And he, I was talking to him about evolutionary perspectives on mood and depression, and and also kind of in the context of a workplace, why you might just feel depressed if you're being, sort of abused by a boss or manipulated, or you're not feeling your status is being respected, and also why you would feel disconnected from your team because you don't really ever see them or kind of bond with them. And just talking to him a little bit about some of the things like sharing food and just kind of having a fairly flat hierarchy where people don't kind of feel that they're being bossed around can just be like a core part of sort of historical ancestral human life. And it's just so easy to share food and kind of connect with people over that food in a way that just makes you feel closer to people. And it's almost illegal in the UK to give free food to businesses to give free food to their employees,
Really?
because yeah. It's a whole nightmare. There's regulations, it's classic well-meaning regulations which were put in place to stop the bosses from getting the really, really nice free food. So then it's like everyone in the office has to have like equal access to free food, and it has to be like the same quality. But that means that like the cleaning staff have to have access to the canteen as well as equally as the people who are there all day. And yeah, basically, and it's kind of taxed in weird ways, and you'll have to employ a whole new person to submit the tax forms to get your free food. So basically, no one does it.
Nonsense.
But these are the sort of simple things that kind of would make people feel closer together and maybe enjoy
So
going
many
more.
unanticipated consequences of well-meaning policies. You know,
Yes.
I just listened to the book Abundance by Ezra Klein when I was on my long drive, and the whole book is about these well-meaning policies um, that keep anything good from happening or good things from happening. And
Which actually we can bring back to evolutionary medicine and psychiatry. We have a thing that was put in place for a reason, but it causes all these problems downstream that you can't get around. Like, oh, yeah, you need an anxiety system, sure, but it's just it's and maybe it's good on average, or it protects against some things, but it also causes all this harm. I mean,
yeah,
okay, at least in the perspective of a natural selection working over millions of years, you'd hope it's at least good on average and hasn't caused over the top harm. But um, yeah, so okay, so I think that it would be good to sort of like wrap up on your perspective on, yeah, like your overarching perspective on like where it's come from being like a young student interested in aging, and how like why on earth, why are we getting old, why aren't we living forever, um and then seeing everything change. Like what's your perspective both on your kind of personal journey, um what are the things that kind of jump out to you as being like the things that you've learned the most about, and then also about like how you've seen the fields change. um
yeah. Well, I've appreciated the chance to have this chat actually, because it's allowed me to kind of go back over a few highlights and see we all have accomplished quite a lot. And maybe it takes us. I mean, Darwin's work, in 1900, what did people think about Darwin? They thought he was just wrong, because the physicists had said the Earth couldn't have been, around that long, and the like. It wasn't until he connected when it was all connected with genetics that it actually started making progress again. And it wasn't until 50 years after that that people started analyzing behavior in evolutionary terms. It wasn't until 20 years after that that people recognized that actual selection doesn't work for the good of, all these fundamental
yeah.
conceptual and theoretical advances were missing. I think what we're doing is providing something that fundamental, and it's going to take that long for it to get integrated. And I think we all have to be as careful as we possibly can be, not to make unjustified claims and all the rest. And, I mean, but in medicine, it's so hard because everybody gets famous by claiming they can cure diabetes or cancer with their special mushroom or something. And I think we have to stay so far away from that in a way that's disappointing, but necessary for the full impact of these conceptual changes to be integrated and used as a foundation for research and become useful. But it's really come along, Adam, and it's coming along faster and faster now, thanks to your efforts from Riyadh and Paul and so many others, and the big Cambridge University Press book that came out a couple of years ago. I think we're really getting there.
Well,
Kind of
yeah,
encouraging.
let me just say for the record that it doesn't need to be stated, but it's very clear that without you having kind of picked up that torch in, well, 1968, when your your invertebrate biology teacher was encouraging you to go to the library, and then carried it and pushed it forward, and set up the societies, and then you still continue behind the scenes. People know your publications, but I also see the huge amounts of work you put in behind the scenes to kind of keep the spark alive, and to integrate new people into the field, and to keep the conferences running, and the and everything. So
And then
it's,
maybe that's a good place to close, Adam, because it's a very simple question. I mean, why the heck didn't natural selection do a better job? And I mean, why do we have all these why are we vulnerable to cancer? Why are we vulnerable to autoimmune disease? Why are we vulnerable to schizophrenia, anxiety? And there's no one answer. But that question, I think, has a lot of mileage left in it. And just encouraging other people to share an interest in that question and figure out ways of testing potential hypotheses. That's been thrilling, and I'm still fascinated by the ideas all kinds of people are coming up with. It's really been thrilling.
yeah, no, that's the paradox that grabbed me almost 10 years ago, and that I haven't been able to let go, and I don't think I can. So
No, once you get it, you say, oh, there's a whole nother kind of explanation needed. Oh,
uh,
whoa.
exactly. But I think probably maybe both of our personalities is you have to be really pursuing it in the face of no one else kind of caring about pursuing it, which is a sort of weird. I mean, we're at a weird stage now where there's enough people around you saying, "Oh, it's a good idea." Everyone says it's a good idea, but no one else wants to pursue it. I don't know why, but anyway, it's just
Well,
yeah, yeah,
it's coming along. I'm glad we have each other to talk to, and
yeah,
I'm glad there's so many people developing things.
yeah. Well, yes, Randolph Nesse, thank you so much for this.
Thank you, Adam. Thanks for all you do, and for this chance to chat. Lovely.
The Evolving Psychiatry podcast is financially supported by the Human Ecology Group of the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine at the University of Zurich.